Hi, this video is intended for applicants to the Turing School of Software and Design, and it's intended for those who maybe haven't seen an LSAT-style logic game or logic problem in the past. We're going to try to give some different strategies to get started and point you in the right direction so that way if you wanted to do some more research, you kind of have a good footing to kind of do that with. Most of these problems or games typically follow the same format. If you look up here, there's like this section that's kind of like, they'll refer to it as like the story, where it's basically kind of like the setup data, the setup information for the problem or the game. Right below that, you'll typically see the clues. And you'll be using these clues, which will kind of like establish rules to kind of work through the rest of the problems. And then following that is like a series of different like questions that you will use and you'll use those clues to answer these questions. So let's get started here. I remember the first time that I started working through one of these, I didn't really have a strategy and I didn't really know what I was doing, and it actually made it really difficult. Once I kind of figured things out, it made it a lot easier. So what we're hoping to do here is give you a little bit of guidance in how to pick a strategy or put together a strategy. The first thing I'm going to do is you'll notice I just pulled up a different screen over here. And what I'm going to use this for is kind of like keeping my notes. This is going to be I'm going to use this as like a scratch pad and just jot things down as I'm working through them. The first thing I want to do is read the story behind this particular game. So it says an organization will hold its first 6 annual meetings in exactly 6 cities: Los Angeles, Montreal, New York, Toronto, Vancouver, and Washington, using each city only once. The following conditions govern the order in which the cities are used. So for the story, basically what we're trying to do is figure out the order that the cities are going to be hosting these annual meetings. So, and each city is only going to hold it once. So what I'm going to do to kind of get moving here is I'm going to jot down the first letter of each of the cities. One thing that I'll see people who maybe have never done one of these before is like trying to hold all of the information in their heads, and that's really difficult to do, especially as we start to encounter some of these different rules. So we'll try to use shorthand as much as we can to kind of help us along the way so we don't have to do so much mental processing. And as we start working through and writing things out, we won't have to write out the full word or the full city or whatever. So up at the top of my scratch pad here, I'm going to make an L, and I'm going to take basically the first letter of each city. So L, M, N for New York, T for Toronto, V, and W. And I know I have to use all of those in each of these problems. The next section right below it we'll refer to as the clues. And sometimes you might hear them referred to as like the rules. And these basically kind of set up the conditions in which we're trying to solve the following questions. So this one said, the first rule here is that Los Angeles must be used in some year after the year in which Toronto is used. So basically, LA has to be after Toronto. I want to jot this down, and I also want to use shorthand for this, so that way it's a little bit easier to process, and I don't have to read like the full sentence every time. What I'm going to go with here is just like because Toronto has to come before LA, or LA has to come after Toronto, I'm going to put the T first, and I'm just going to put like maybe a little arrow kind of signifying that LA has to come afterwards. The second rule there is that Vancouver must be used either immediately before or immediately after Washington. So that's going to I could do something like VW or WV. And either one of those has to be the case. I'll also just put little numbers next to these rules as well. The meeting in Toronto must be separated from the meeting in Montreal by meetings in exactly 2 other cities. Now this one's like a little bit more tricky. So we've got 2 cities in between Toronto and Montreal, but it doesn't say anything about the order in which they have to be. So it could be like Toronto could come first or Montreal could come first. So to kind of capture that, I'm going to do T/M, and I'll do like 2 underscores. So it can be that, or it can be MT. So basically, it's going to be Toronto space Montreal, or Montreal space Toronto. And this last rule, it says the meeting in Vancouver must be separated from the meeting in Los Angeles by meetings in exactly 2 other cities. So this is kind of the same deal, just with Vancouver and LA. So I'm going to go ahead and jot this down. I'll go V/L space L/V. And what this is basically saying is that it's either going to be Vancouver with 2 spaces followed by LA, or LA followed by 2 spaces or 2 cities and Vancouver at the end. The next thing I want to do here is start working through the first question. And this one says, which one of the following lists the cities in an order in which they could be used for the meetings from the 1st year through the 6th? One of the things I think I'd like to do for this particular problem is just check through each of these rules, and we can eliminate. So we've got these rules in the upper right-hand corner of our scratch sheet. I can use these rules to eliminate some of these options here. So I'm going to draw, or I kind of keep tabs on what we're working on here. On my scratch pad, I'm going to go with 17, and then I'll do A, B, C, D, and E. And we'll just kind of cross off the ones that we've worked through. The first rule here is that Toronto has to come before LA. So let's kind of see if there's any that violate this rule. The first one is okay, but B is eliminated, right? Because in B we have Toronto coming after LA, so we can get rid of B. And the rest of these look okay. Yep, I think we're good. The second rule is that Vancouver and Washington have to be right next to each other. The first A is okay, C is okay, D is not, so we can eliminate D. And then E looks like it's okay as well. The third rule, you'll notice that I didn't go through B because we've already eliminated B as a possibility. The third rule here is that Toronto and Montreal have to be spaced out by 2 other cities in between. So let's take a look here and see if we can find any that violate this rule. So the possibilities on the table are A, and that looks okay. Next up is C, and Toronto and Montreal, yep, that looks all right. And then E, that is not. We've only got 1 city in between Toronto and Montreal, so let's get rid of that one. The final rule here is that Vancouver and LA have to be separated by 2 cities. So A looks like it is good with that. And then the last one to check here is C. Vancouver and LA are separated by 3 cities in this particular scenario. So we can eliminate C from the possibilities, and that leaves us with an answer of A. All right, so let's move on to number 18 here. Which one of the following must be true? These must be true problems can get a little bit tricky. Now, sometimes they're going to be really easy, but other times you might find that you have to work through several different scenarios. Before we start doing that, though, one thing I like to do is see if any of the previous answers or previous questions that we've worked through can reveal anything about this particular problem. And if we look at this example here, you'll notice that in the upper number 17, the answer there was A, right? So we knew that that is like a legit order that this could happen in. And if you look at D for number 18, it says that New York is used either immediately before or immediately after Vancouver. We know that that doesn't have to be true, right? Because if we look at number 17 up above, we saw that New York and Vancouver were not right next to each other. So we can eliminate D as a possibility for number 18. So I'm just going to write out my letters here and eliminate D. The other thing to kind of just keep in mind as you're working through these like must be true problems is that there is a difference between must be true or could be true or should be true. The reality is that many of these answers here for like the remaining like A, B, C, and E, that they could all be true, but only one of them must be true. So keep that in mind as we're working through this. In fact, like as we start to examine this problem a little more, I'm starting to see this pattern emerge between A, B, and C, that all three of those use some sort of combination of Toronto, Montreal, or Montreal and Toronto. I kind of want to explore this just a little more and see if we can extract any more information from that. If you look at A, Toronto is used in the first year. If we look at the rules associated with Toronto, the third rule in our upper right-hand corner on our scratch paper, we have Toronto and Montreal that are supposed to be separated by two cities, right? So if Toronto ends up being in that first slot, is like the first year, that automatically means that Montreal has to be in the fourth slot, right? So like it would go Toronto, two cities in between, and then Montreal. Well, that automatically eliminates both A and B from the possible answers, because there can be only one of these as being must be true. And if A is true, then that means that B has to be true, or vice versa. And that just will not satisfy the answer here. So let's eliminate A and B. The other thing that's interesting about C is that it says that Toronto is used at some time before Montreal is used. But that isn't really what the rules say. The rules say that Toronto and Montreal can be spaced by two cities, but it doesn't really matter which one is first or which one comes after. And so we can then eliminate C as being a possibility as well. We might want to then, just to be safe, because we only use like the process of elimination to get to the answer here for E, it might be like good to just like work through a few different possibilities and just see if it's adding up. If like if in fact like this last one, E, says that the meeting in New York is separated from the meeting in Washington by meetings in exactly two other cities. If we look up above, the answer for A, number 17, Washington and New York are in fact separated by two cities. We could then, just to be thorough, try out a couple of different scenarios here and see if we're seeing that same pattern emerge. And I think we should go ahead and try that out. I'm going to make 6 slots, one for each city in the order that they're going to be in. And I'm going to see if we can replicate this pattern of having Washington and New York separated by two different cities. So to start off with, let's go ahead and try out like Vancouver, for example. Let's go ahead and put Vancouver in the first slot. If V is in the first slot, based on that second rule, we know that W has to come in the second slot. If V is in the first slot, that also means, based on the fourth rule, that LA would be two cities away. That would put LA, or L, in that fourth slot. If L is in that fourth slot, then the first rule tells us that Toronto, or T, has to come right before L. And the third rule tells us that T and M have to be separated by two cities. So that would put M in the last slot, leaving us with New York here. And let's see if this matches what we were trying to answer here, that the meeting in New York is separated from the meeting in Washington by meetings in exactly two other cities. So we have New York here, Washington here, 1, 2. This does in fact match that. Let's do one more just to be extra safe. And let's try Washington in that first slot. We then know that V has to come in the second slot based on the second rule. If V is there, we know that L has to be 2 away based on the fourth rule. If L is there, we know that T has to be in either of these slots, so there has to be a T in here. The third rule for T says that it has to be separated by M by 2. If we put T here, we can't get M to be 2 spaces away, so that means that T has to go here. If we put T in the third slot, then that means that M has to go in the last slot, which then leaves New York right here. Are New York and Washington separated by 2 cities? New York is here, Washington's here. We got our 1, we got our 2. We're good to go. So I believe, I think this is pretty convincing that E is in fact the answer for number 18. Okay, so readjusting my screen here a little bit. Let's move on to number 19. Actually, right before we do that, let's just record that last rule. We just determined that Washington and New York were going to have to be separated by 2 cities in a similar pattern to the third and fourth rule there. So I just want to make sure we don't forget about that. Might be useful. So let's move on to 19. And this particular question says that there is exactly one possible order in which the cities are used if which one of the following is true. So what we're looking at here is we're trying to figure out, hey, which one of these is going to give us a fully determined list of the order. So what that probably means is that multiple of these could lead to solutions that could be true, but we need the one that is going to show us only one possible order. So let's start with A. I'm just going to work through like one by one here and just kind of see how it plays out. A has Los Angeles in the 5th year. So we put L there. We know that V, based on that fourth rule, would have to be 2 cities away, which would put V in this second slot. If V is there, we end up with W either in the second or first or third slot. Don't really see much else that we can determine from this, I don't think. Yeah. I think that there's too many possibilities. Let's move on to B. Oops. And B says Montreal is used in the 6th year. So if Montreal is here, we know then based on the third rule that T would have to be in that third slot. If T is there, we know that L would have to be here. If L was there, that could put V in either of these slots. But, you know, this is kind of feeling the same way where it's not super clear what the answer is going to be. I think there's too many possibilities. Let's move on to C. In this one, New York is going to be in the 5th slot. If New York is in the 5th slot, we know that W then has to be here. And that's based on our new rule, number 5. If W is there, that puts V in either slot 1 or 3. Can we determine anything else? I don't think so. Doesn't seem very clear. Let's move to D. Vancouver is used in the 1st year. So if we put Vancouver here, that means that W has to be there. We also know that L and V, based on rule number 4, have to be separated by 2 cities. So that means that L has to go here. T has to come before L. So that puts T there. T and M have to be separated by 2. So that puts M in the last slot and New York here. Yeah, that seems fully determined. I think the answer is D. Let's just check E to be safe. But I'm pretty confident that that is going to be our answer. E, Washington is used in the 2nd year. Washington goes here. That means that V has to go in either one of these slots. New York would go 2 away, so New York would end up here. Yeah, I don't see how this plays out, and there's like a number of different ways I think that this could shake out. I'm pretty confident that D is in fact the answer here. Number 20, which one of the following is a complete and accurate list of the years in which Washington could be used? This one's interesting. I don't have all of my previous answers easily displayed here, but if I think back to some of the ones that we were answering earlier, let me just kind of move this screen out of the way. We know that Washington showed up in number 17 in the third slot there, right? So that are there any of these possible solutions for 20? So A, B, C, D, and E. Do any of these eliminate number 3 from there? Yeah, D does not have the third. Does not have this third slot there. We can eliminate that, right? Because the answer to number A, or to question number 17 was A, and that had Washington in that third slot. I also remember thinking back to number 18 here, that we were able, as we were working through some of the different scenarios, we for sure were able to get Washington in that first slot as well. So let's see if that helps us out at all. We did have Washington in the first slot there, and that B and C do not have Washington in the first slot, so we can eliminate B and C from there as well. That leaves us with A, and that leaves us with E. Let's see if we can get Washington for A in either the third or the fifth slot. I feel like, well, let's see. Maybe we should try to see if we can get it in the fourth slot, right? So like, because E has 4 and 6 included in its results. If we can get it in either the fourth slot or the sixth slot, then we know that E is the answer. So let's go ahead and try that. And let's see if we can get, let's put W in that last slot there, the sixth slot. If W's there, then we for sure have V in the fifth slot based on the second rule. If V is there, that means that L has to be 2 away from V, which is the second slot, and that's based on the fourth rule. If L is there, can we fully determine anything else? T has to come before L, so T would go in the first slot. T has to be separated from M by 2 based on that third rule, so M would be there. And that leaves us with New York, which is here, and our Washington and New York, in fact, separated by 2 based on that fifth rule. New York's here, Washington's here, 1, 2. Yep, I think this is it. And it looks like E is, in fact, the answer. I think this is a good stopping point for the purposes of this video. There are other types of games out there as well. This one is very, the strategy that I showed here is very specific to sequencing style games. Some of the other types of games out there are grouping and matching. If you wanted to do some additional research on those things, you could do like a Google search for LSAT logic games, matching strategy, or LSAT logic game grouping strategy, and probably start to get some different resources there as well. You could even look a little bit further into this specific type of logic game, which is the sequencing game. So maybe doing an additional search around LSAT logic sequencing would also be worth your time if you're looking for that sort of thing. I hope this proves to be useful, and good luck during the interview process. Thanks so much.